I don't know how much I'm going to have to add here. One thing I may add is the group photo from this session where we started the planning for CMIP6. You may recognize several critical people in this photo. Here's Elise, James, John Katzenberger, and Allison. So they're the really central components of this whole operation. So what came out of this was one of the new aspects is we wanted to get a lot of feedback, because after CMIP5 it was such a huge effort. The modeling groups were all complaining because they said we had to do all these runs at the last minute. You guys are crazy if you think we're going to do this again. A lot of the users were saying you didn't collect the right data. We didn't have the data we needed to do the analysis we wanted to do. So we really made a conscious effort it's actually over a year-long period to try to get as much feedback and input as we could from the community. This involved a couple of different things. One was a questionnaire that the CMIP panel put together that a number of you may have filled out. We sent it to all the modeling groups. A lot of individuals filled it out, basically getting feedback on what you think you'd like to see different if we did another CMIP phase. We put this EOS article together, which asked for anybody who read the article could provide feedback, and so that was a very public way of trying to solicit input. So we got all this input back from all the elements of the community, and then tried to come up with some things that were a little bit different. So one of the things that people said they really thought was missing in CMIP5 was kind of a science framework. So we said, okay, well let's provide more of a science framework, because it was just kind of, here's all these experiments, everybody run them, and then we'll see what happens in the end, you know, and that's kind of the way it worked, which is always the way the CMIP phases worked, which wasn't a big deal when you were doing in CMIP1 a 100-year control run and a 70-year 1% per year CO2 increase run. So that was a lot more simple, but as you get more and more components to this and more communities involved with this and more people involved with this and more computer resources, governments have their eyes on this. This is relevant for the IPCC assessments. It's become this kind of massive thing. So conveniently, the WCRP had just gone through this painful 2-year process to come up with these grand challenges. So there was these 6 grand challenges. Since this is a WCRP project, this was a nice way to frame this CMIP6 in terms of keeping in mind science questions that would relate to these grand challenges. Because we're collaborating closely with the biogeochemistry community, and this AIMS group is kind of the counterpart in the biogeochemistry community to WGCM, which is the working group on coupled models, which is the WCRP panel that runs this CMIP activity. They had this kind of placeholder in there. They didn't quite know what their grand challenge was going to be, but they wanted to have something on biogeochemical forcings and feedbacks. And then we came up with 3 kind of specific questions. So one was related to forcings, systematic errors. Can we understand better systematic errors in models? And then how can we assess changes in climate variability, predictability, and uncertainties? And the predictability part is obviously something that's relevant to DCPP. So George already showed this. The only thing maybe I can add to this is somebody asked me, I made that comment that at that 2013 meeting we had some really big arguments, pretty violent arguments actually. And we had these votes, and somebody said, well, what were you voting over? Well, one of the things was what you put in the deck. So one school of thought said, really, CMIP is about future climate change. So in the deck, in addition to these kind of simplified, idealized things, there should be a 20th and a 21st century simulation, because that should be some kind of theme that's communicated to the science community and to the funding agencies in various countries. The counterargument was, no, we should not include that in the deck. The deck should just be about simulations you do when you're developing a new model version. The deck should only be things that people are already doing. So this would reflect when a modeling group develops a new model version, typically you do an AMIP simulation with your atmospheric model, you do a long control run, you do a 1% per year CO2 increase run to get the transient climate response, and you do an abrupt 4 times CO2 run to get the equilibrium climate sensitivity. That should be the bare minimum. Well, this was very, very contentious, and then the question was, okay, if you included a 20th and 21st century run, which forcings do you use? Because the idea was, well, let's just rerun what we ran in CMIP6. And we said, well, no, we're going to update the forcings. We're going to have different forcings. And RCP 8.5, which was the candidate to rerun, so we had a common point of contact between CMIP5 and CMIP6. We'd run the same climate scenario. The scenario people were saying, no, we're going to change RCP 8.5. It's not even worth running it again. And the start date's going to be different because the future in the RCP scenario started in January 1st of 2006. We were pushing the scenario community to have the future start in 2015. So it was a huge hassle.
Why this discussion didn't come up for AMIP, for the AMIP simulation? Because you're forcing the AMIP simulation.
Well, everybody seemed to be okay with the AMIP runs, and they thought that was much less contentious. It was more the future climate change aspect and how central you make future climate change as a central feature to CMIP.
No, but for the historical, AMIP and historical should share some forcing.
Well, yeah, they should. Yeah. I mean, this wasn't here yet. We were just talking about what was going to be in the deck.
I actually objected it for AMIP staying there because I proposed OMIP and the land people proposed NANMIP.
Yeah.
And so it got out of hand.
Yeah.
So AMIP is there just for purely historical reasons.
Yeah.
But OMIP may get in and NANMIP may get in.
Yeah. But those votes we had, I think there were 4 different combinations of things, and I hope, I don't know if Michael, you probably have a record of that. And literally, Gavin Schmidt was at the front of the room with his iPhone taking a picture of who had their hands up so that we could document who was voting for what. In the end, we decided just to leave the deck experiments in this very basic set, and the compromise was, let's have this. And the deck experiments would be the same for all future elements of CMIP. You do these again and again for every new model version you had. For CMIP6 in particular, there would be just an historical simulation and not a future climate change simulation. We decided all the future climate change simulations should be in scenario MIP, which some people still aren't happy with, but that's what was decided. So that's what I could add to that, what George showed. And again, the deck experiments are chosen to provide continuity, don't evolve much over time, well established. And the important thing is, this is what groups are doing anyway. So we wanted to reflect, we didn't want to create new work. This is kind of what groups are doing anyway.
That's the forecast.
Well, yeah, but as you say, there may not be much of that. And then the 20th century run would just be a benchmark and all those kinds of things. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay, George already went over this, so I don't need to talk about that again. By the way, just as a comment, there had never been a set of criteria for MIPS in any previous phase of CMIP. And we said, well, we should have some criteria, because one of the complaints that people had about CMIP5 was it seems to be, you're trying to be all things to all people. You should try to focus it somehow. And so we said, well, maybe we could actually have some criteria. So we came up with this list of 10. It was originally more like 20, and we kind of had to get it down to 10. This is probably still too many. You know, we were shooting for maybe 5, but we ended up with 10. This is another version of what George showed, but this is just all the list of the MIPS. The different colors are where they are in the process. DCPP is red because I think the final experimental design isn't quite there yet. There's these things that aren't quite MIPS, but they're in that same category, but they're also going on, and we're acknowledging them. CORDEX, which is the regional plant modeling experiment. DYNVAR, which was mainly just not an experiment that wanted additional runs done. They just wanted certain field saves. They could do certain types of analyses. And one thing that's a new feature, which I think is really significant for various reasons, is the VIA Advisory Board. And that's not quite the right name. They changed it recently. But this is the first attempt to really tangibly connect to the impacts community, the mysterious, elusive Working Group 2 community. So we've been trying to connect to this community for as long as CMIP has been going on. And it's always very difficult because they're the ones that are kind of on the receiving end of all the model experiments that we run. and they always complain that we don't save the fields they're interested in. They're always lagging behind. They have no seat at the table. They have no input into the process. And our response to them was well, form a group. Form a group to represent your community so you can communicate with us better. And the same thing happened with the integrated assessment modelers. They're the ones that produce the scenarios. There's various integrated assessment modeling groups around. They formed something called the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium, the IAMC, which is kind of their counterpart to the WGCM. So now we have somebody we can talk to when we need to negotiate about scenarios. We needed somebody to talk to that represented the working group 2, the impacts community. So it's basically been Cynthia Rosenzweig and Alex Ruane who have been trying to get this organized. I think they've been getting some good support from their community. They're actually adding in a climate service aspect, which is, I think this is not quite the final name, but the climate service part of this is going to be part of that. So that's basically to try to connect to this other community, which is going to be kind of a first ever kind of thing about this. Yeah, George?
There's only like 4 or 5 groups that say they're participating. What is that?
Well, that's because they're not really a MIP.
Yeah,
So nobody knew how to respond to that on their questionnaire.
It's not a MIP, right?
No. That's why they're in this kind of, below this dashed line, they're in a kind of a different category. So it's more of an organizational thing, but they will have a request of fields that they want saved. So that's where they kind of enter in.
They don't have an experiment.
They don't have an experiment, they're going to have a list of fields.
These are analysis MIPs.
An analysis MIPS, basically. Well, Cortex isn't quite that, but these are kind of in a different category from the MIPS. And then this thing about the number of groups, and we had this big a debate about when does a MIP become viable as a multi-model ensemble activity? How many groups would it take? How many models would it take to have a nice multi-model data set? And we came up with the number 8. And I think that number 8 came because it was, there was 31 models, I think, and 8 was roughly a little more than a quarter. So we figured if you got about a quarter of all the models running a MIP, that may give you a nice set. So that's why when the idea, another new feature of this was that we were going to try to, the CMIP panel was going to try to get out of the way of this communication between the MIPS and the modeling groups, because in the end, we're going to try to put the weight of the decision on the modeling groups as to how many experiments they ran. So in CMIP5, the modeling groups felt they were required to run all experiments, and they just hated that. So he said, okay, you can decide which, we'll give you a menu of MIPS, and you decide which experiments you want to run. And that's what the result of this is. So modeling groups basically signed up for the MIPS they thought they were interested in running. If there was at least 8 groups signed up, chances are you were a viable MIP. So that was another kind of new feature.
There are 2 different numbers here. One is the number of groups, another is the number of models.
Number of models, yeah.
So
this
is just groups. Some
Groups with models, at least 8 models. It may be, like a group would say, we're interested in running this, and they may run more than 1 model, but at least you got 8 models.
8 distinct models.
Yeah, well, maybe or maybe not, depending on who you talk to. This is not real relevant for this group, but this is another very contentious part of this process, is which scenarios you decide to run for scenario MIP. And what has happened was, because we have this connection with the Integrated System Modeling Consortium, and they're the community that produces scenarios, when we negotiated on the 4 RCP scenarios, which are the ones here, there were 4 of them, and they were basically kind of based on radiated forcing at the year 2100, roughly. They said, okay, we're going to supply you these 4 scenarios. The number 4 was carefully negotiated. We were trying to shoot for 3, and they said, no, we want 2 in the middle so that people have to run 4. It won't be easy just to run 1 in the middle. So that's why we ended up with 4. Because we're always trying to say fewer scenarios, and they're trying to say more scenarios, so we negotiate that. So this parallel process. So the modeling groups went off and ran whatever these scenarios they wanted to run. Meanwhile, the integrated assessment modelers went off and they came up with more hundreds of scenarios because they can produce many, many scenarios because they can run these on laptops. So they came up with kind of 5 categories of scenarios, these SSPs. And they have different storylines because this is, they game the system, right? So they're saying, okay, what if population grows at this rate? And what if we get alternative energies that come in 2040? And what if this happens? What if that happens? And for each one of these what if things, they can devise a scenario. And they kind of have stories that go with the scenarios because you're trying to invent a future, basically. So they kind of came up with these 5 categories of possible futures. And then they had these kind of radiative forcings. And so you get this kind of matrix. And what they ended up deciding on, they were trying to match the SSPs with something that was close in terms of radiative forcing with the old RCPs. So we'd have at least some point of contact, at least in terms of radiative forcing, between CMIP5 and CMIP6. So we came up with they came up with these 4 scenarios that match the RCPs at least to a first order for 3 of them. This one in here, the SSP3, basically RCP7 is a little bit different. But that's their 4 tier 1 scenarios, and then they've got tier 2 scenarios, which are these blue dots. And then what's just come up in the last 2 weeks has been a, and apparently it was this SUBSTA meeting. I don't think I went to the SUBSTA meeting.
Can I stop you?
Yeah, the battery's fine. Okay. Is that a good pause time? Yeah. Anybody know what SUBSTA stands for? It's a negotiating. I can't remember what the acronym is. It's where the government delegations show up. Yeah. It's where government delegations show up, and they. It's conference of the parties and all this other stuff. They want a scenario which is 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial. So that's below RCP 2.6. RCP 2.6 was designed, it was by design to produce warming 2 degrees above pre-industrial. Now they want something that's 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, even lower than that. And so it's taken 2 years to come up with this plan. And now they throw this hand grenade in. So now, after many telecons, there's one going on tomorrow. It looks like we're going to have a low scenario down here in tier 3. It's going to take 2 years to come up with the scenario, vet it, get buy-in from the communities, blah, blah, blah. But
it would be a nice word that we don't transfer ourselves into the models.
Yeah.
Well,
a lot of people say RCP 2.6 is already out of the realm of possibility, but the government say, well, we can't be policy prescriptive. Who knows? Maybe in 2040 somebody will invent some technology we can pull a lot of CO2 out of the air. Anyway.
What are the colors for the things at the bottom?
Those are kind of the status of the various MIPS that may run some of these scenarios.
They know that if they do that, there'll be a deluge in a lot of places. Yeah. Because all the water will come out.
Yeah, right. Another new thing that I'm not going to say anything about is the desire to have routine benchmarking. So when a group submits some new runs to the Earth System Grid Federation, there'd be a package of diagnostics. It would be run automatically and go on a web page, and people could look at some diagnostic plots as a kind of a matter of course. George already talked about this. So just this is the last slide. So for CMIP6, timelines are in place. We got all this kind of set up. We've got the scenarios pretty much in here, the tiers. We have the next WGCM meeting is in October. That's going to be along with a CMIP workshop that some of you may be attending. It's going to be kind of what we call a Hawaii-style workshop where we have just a lot of short presentations and posters for a week. And then there's these special issue kind of things. And I don't know, what's the plan for DCPP to write one of these special issue papers? Are you going to have to lead that, I assume?
Yes, so.
Yeah. Or maybe Doug, yeah.
Anyway, we'll
Yeah.
work on it.
Okay. That's all I had.
Very good. Thank you very much.
very much.
Jerry, I had one question about lake commerce. I want to have a MIP like AgMIP in Cynthia's scheme.
Yeah.
Is there any way to accommodate?
Sure. You can kind of join in any time, but if you're missed kind of the first cut, it's going to be harder because the modeling groups have already made their decisions and already allocated computer time. What the modeling groups tried to do was say, okay, we think we have so many million of hours. That means we can run so many thousands of years of simulation. Each of these MIPS has, you try to figure out how many years is involved, and then you try to figure out how many you can do. So each modeling group kind of went through that process. So if you come in later with another MIP, I mean, you're not going to be kicked out, but it's going to be much harder for you to get your MIP run in this round. And there'll always be another round. So that's...
Is it conceivable that you could piggyback on other MIPs?
You
like
could.
Land use MIP and get what you need from that?
Yeah, you could.
And add to it your own?
You could.
Yeah.
And the thing, and you kind of detected, and George was facetious, but he's actually true. I mean, you can detect a much higher degree of regulation in this round of CMIP6. That was because it was just getting so big and so unmanageable, it was really difficult to manage. But anybody that's worked in WCRP knows that this is a coercive activity. Nobody gets paid any extra money to do any of this. So you're basically trying to get people to participate as volunteers to do a lot of work. And so you can't really order them to do anything. You can ask them nicely and then hope that they kind of go along, and usually people are pretty good about cooperating. But the fact that this has even got to this point, and the 6th phase of the CMIP indicates there are a lot of people that are really interested in cooperating and spending a lot of their own time and effort. And there are a lot of funding agencies willing to put money into it. And so I think that's really good, and a lot of science comes out of it. So I think that's the encouraging thing about these big coordinated activities.